The summer of 1970 in Yuba County, California, had been unlike any in recent memory. The drought had been merciless, baking the fields until they cracked, drawing down the reservoirs until the cracked bottoms looked like dried skin. Farmers were desperate. The county authorized the reopening of several long-sealed wells to keep livestock alive and crops from dying completely. One of those wells sat behind an old, weather-beaten farmhouse on the edge of wheatland. It was a lonely property, surrounded by yellowed grass that whispered in the wind, with a skeletal barn leaning at its side. The house had been empty for more than a decade, shuttered after its last no. A reclusive man named Clarence Dyer had died alone in 1962. The well behind it had been covered and sealed years before that, officially because the water had turned unsafe. Unofficially, neighbors whispered about things better left down there. On a blistering Tuesday morning, a county work crew arrived to unseal the old well. The men worked quietly, chipping away at the thick, rusted bolts and prying loose the corroded metal plate. When the final piece came free, the smell hit them first. It was faint at first, musty, earthy, but with an underlying sweetness that every seasoned worker knew was wrong. Death has a scent, even when it's decades old. They lowered a flashlight, its beam cutting down through 30 feet of darkness. The first thing the light caught was not water. It was something pale and irregular, jumbled together in a way that made no sense. The foreman swore softly and told the youngest of the crew to call the sheriff. By the time deputies arrived, half the men had already backed away from the opening, muttering under their breath. Sheriff Tom Hardwick peered down himself. He was an old hand in law enforcement, not easily rattled, but he stood there for a long silent moment, before straightening. "We're gonna need the coroner. And more lights," he said. "Nobody touches a damn thing." When the lights came, they revealed the pale shapes more clearly. Small, fragile forms, bones jumbled together in a tangle at the bottom. Some were still partly wrapped in scraps of fabric that had long since lost their color. The coroner, a tall man named Dr. Jacob Hill, went down with a harness and came up pale-faced, shaking his head. "Children," he said quietly. "A lot of them. In total, they pulled 11 tiny skeletons from the black throat of that well. Each one measured between 3 and 4 feet in length. Some smaller. None had any signs of coffins, burial rituals or markers. There were no metal buttons or buckles, no clues to date the clothing. The only common detail was that all the skeletons were missing certain bones, as if someone had taken them." The news broke quickly and the people of Yuba County were stunned. How could 11 children disappear without a trace? Why had no one reported them missing? That's when people began to remember Clarence Dyer. He had lived alone in that farmhouse since the late 19th. Neighbors said he was quiet, almost unnervingly so. He rarely came into town except for supplies, but there were stories, always stories. In the summer of 1953, a traveling salesman swore he had seen 2 small children in Dyer's yard. They looked thin, almost sick, and when he waved to them they darted inside. Later, when he mentioned it in town, the locals just shrugged. "He takes in runaways," someone had told him, "orphans that nobody else wants." Others claimed they had seen different children at different times, always quiet, never speaking. They would appear for a few months, and then disappear, and Dyer would never explain where they went. When asked, he'd just say, "They've gone home," but no one could ever find out where home was. By the time the sheriff's office began digging through old records, they realized there were no legal adoption papers, no fostering documents, no reports of missing children in the area from those years, at least, none that matched the vague timeline. It was as if the children had slipped in and out of the world without ever existing on paper. Some of the older townsfolk began sharing unsettling memories. One woman, who had been a little girl in the 1950s, remembered riding her bike past the Dyer place. She said she heard singing, high, thin voices singing an unfamiliar lullaby. But when she stopped to listen, the singing stopped, and the yard was empty. Another man claimed that on more than one night, walking home late, he had heard crying like a child sobbing coming from somewhere near the barn. There were rumors of Dyer digging late at night, carrying burlap sacks toward the well, but no one ever confronted. In those days, people minded their own business, and besides, Clarence Dyer was the kind of man you didn't look in the eye too long. The more the sheriff learned, the colder the case seemed to become. The coroner estimated that the skeletons had been down there anywhere from 10 to 20 years. There were no obvious signs of trauma on the bones, no bullet holes, no knife marks, but several of the smaller skulls showed healed fractures. Some teeth were missing in ways that didn't match natural law. The county searched old archives, orphanage records, even police reports from neighboring towns. Nothing. It was as though these children had been ghosts to begin with. When the local newspaper ran the story, it caused a stir far beyond Yuba County. Reporters from Sacramento and San Francisco descended on the small town. They prowled around the Dyer farmhouse, snapping photos of the leaning barn, the rusting swing set, half buried in the weeds, and the yawning black hole of the well. But the story only deepened the sense of unease, because the house itself seemed wrong. Even in daylight, people said it felt heavy, oppressive. Reporters claimed that inside, the air was unnaturally cold, and the walls still carried faint traces of children's drawings. Stick figures scratched in pencil, faded but still visible. One Sacramento journalist wrote that he had spent half an hour in the house, and in that time, he'd heard what sounded like soft footsteps upstairs, even though the floors were sagging and unsafe. Another swore that while photographing the kitchen, she heard faint laughter behind her, but when she turned, she was alone. Within weeks, the media frenzy died down. No leads emerged, no relatives stepped forward, and the bones were eventually buried in a shared grave in the county cemetery, marked only by a plain stone that read, 11 lost children. But the locals still talk about it. They say that on some nights, when the wind is just right, you can stand by the fence near the Dyer property and hear voices drifting up from the old well, whispers and giggles, like a secret shared between friends. And sometimes, if you're very unlucky, you might hear cry. The farmhouse has collapsed now, little more than a pile of wood and rusting nails. The barn is gone, but the well is still there, capped with a fresh slab of steel welded shut by the county. No one goes near it after dark, because Yuba County remembers, and the ground remembers too. That autumn, a heavy fog began rolling into Yuba County most nights, settling low over the fields and roads, until everything felt muffled and distant. It was in that kind of fog that Deputy Mark Calder found himself pulled back toward the Dyer property. He told himself it was just part of the ongoing investigation, a final check to make sure no evidence had been overlooked. But there was something about the well, about the way it had looked when they first pried open the cap, that gnawed at him when he tried to sleep. Mark parked his cruiser on the overgrown drive. The air was damp and cold, and the headlights only cut a short tunnel through the grayness. Beyond that, the farmhouse ruin was barely visible, a warped silhouette against the fog. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out, the crunch of gravel under his boots sounding louder than it should have. The well sat behind the collapsed remains of the house, the new steel cover gleaming faintly in the beam of his light. He walked toward it, careful where he stepped. Old boards and rusted nails jutted up through the weeds. The cover was solid, welded all the way around, but as he stood over it, Mark swore he felt a faint vibration under his boots. He crouched, pressed a hand to the steel. The metal was cold, and it was humming. It was so faint, he thought he might be imagining it, until something else happened. A soft sound, just under the edge of hearing, like a sigh. He jerked his hand back, stumbling slightly. The fog seemed to thicken around him, and for a second he thought he saw movement in the weeds. But when he swung his flashlight, there was nothing, just the fog, curling in strange patterns. The official case was still open, though it was on the verge of being shelved as unsolvable. Sheriff Hardwick had been pushing the state to send forensic anthropologists, but the budget wasn't there. The bones had already been examined twice, and both times the conclusion had been the same: no conclusive cause of death, no definitive timeline. The only anomalies were the missing small bones, phalanges, parts of the ribs, and those partially healed fractures on several skulls. Mark couldn't let it go. In his off hours he dug through every scrap of information he could find on Clarence Dyer. Dyer had been born in 1898 in Oregon, the youngest of 6 children. His mother died when he was 12, his father 2 years later. From then on,
He drifted through odd jobs, lumber camps, fishing boats, migrant work. He came to Yuba County in 1946, buying the farmhouse and its surrounding acreage for cheap. Neighbors described him as polite but distant. He didn't drink, didn't attend church, and never married. What he did do was travel. There were records of him making trips to Nevada, Oregon, and even as far as Idaho, always for short periods, always returning with something loaded in the back of his truck, covered with a tarp. No one knew. One detail kept catching Mark's eye. Between 1948 and 1959, there were small newspaper mentions from towns Dyer had passed through, each one noting a missing child, a little boy vanishing from a rest stop in Reno, a girl last seen playing in her yard in Medford, a brother and sister disappearing from a fairground in Boise. Each case was isolated, separated by miles and months. But the pattern was there if you knew to look. Mark brought it to the sheriff, but Hardwick only sighed. We can't link him to those disappearances without more than a travel log. Hell, Dyer's been dead almost a decade. Even if he did it, we're chasing smoke. Still, Mark couldn't shake the image of those bones at the bottom of the well. He started talking to older locals, people who'd been around in Dyer's time. That's when he met Alice Kinney, who had grown up on a farm 2 miles down the road from Dyer. Alice was 82, sharp-eyed, despite her years, and when Mark asked her about him, she pursed her lips and leaned back in her chair. Clarence wasn't right, she said finally. Not mean, exactly, but he had ideas. My daddy didn't like me going near his place, said Clarence kept things in his house that weren't his. What do you mean? Mark asked. Alice hesitated, then told him a story she'd never told the sheriff. One summer afternoon in 1954, she and her friend Josie had been riding their bikes down the road. As they passed the Dyer place, they saw a little girl in the yard. She was wearing a faded blue dress, barefoot, and she had the thinnest arms Alice had ever seen. The girl didn't wave or smile. She just stood there, watching. When Alice slowed her bike to say hello, Clarence came out of the barn. He looked at us like we were trespassing. Alice said, told us to get on home. The way he said it, I swear my blood went cold. We left fast, but I looked back once, and that girl was gone, just gone. When Alice's father confronted Dyer about it later, Dyer told him the girl was a visitor, who'd already left. Alice never saw her again. As Mark drove home that night, the fog seemed to follow him. Every shadow looked like it might be hiding something. His radio crackled faintly, but no one was there. He kept thinking about that girl in the faded blue dress, and how easily a child could vanish in those days. No questions asked. A week later, Mark decided to visit the property one more time, this time at night. He didn't tell the sheriff. The moon was a thin sliver, and the fog clung low, rolling like slow water. He parked his cruiser well back from the drive, and walked in with just his flashlight. The air was colder here. The ruins of the house loomed in the dark, and the well's steel cover shone faintly. He stood over it again, listening. At first there was nothing, just the sound of his own breathing. Then very faintly he heard it. A child's voice. Not words exactly, more like a hum, the melody of a lullaby. His scalp prickled, and the beam of his flashlight trembled. He leaned close. The humming stopped. Silence pressed against his ears. Then just when he was about to step back, something tapped the underside of the steel cover. Once, twice. Mark staggered backward, heart hammering. His boot caught on a board, and he went down hard. As he scrambled up, the fog around him seemed to shift, and in that milky white curtain, he thought he saw shapes, small thin shapes, moving, watching. He didn't run. He forced himself to walk steadily back to his cruiser, every nerve screaming. When he got inside and locked the doors, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely start the engine. The next day, he returned in daylight, with a deputy friend, but of course there was nothing unusual. No sounds, no shapes, just the same old ruin, the same silent well. His friend teased him about ghost stories, but Mark knew what he'd heard. Over the following weeks, other strange things began to happen in town. A farmer a mile away swore he saw children playing in his field at dawn, but when he walked toward them they faded into the fog. A truck driver passing through late at night claimed a barefoot girl darted across the road in front of him. When he stopped to check, there were no footprints in the dust. By November, the Dyer property had become a place kids dared each other to visit, especially on foggy nights. Most came back laughing, but a few came back pale, refusing to talk about what they'd seen, and in the middle of it all, the well sat there sealed, but not silent.
Snow was rare in Yuba County, but that winter, the cold came early, sharper than anyone expected. By late December, frost clung to the weeds around the Dyer property, and the fog was thinner, giving way to a brittle, pale sunlight during the day. It should have made the place less threatening, but in a strange way, it made it worse, like a wound exposed under harsh light. Deputy Mark Calder had stopped going there at night. The last visit had stayed with him in a way he couldn't explain. Sometimes, in the early hours before dawn, he would wake in his apartment to the faint sound of tapping, 3 soft knocks coming from somewhere near his window. He lived on the 2nd floor. The first time it happened, he thought it was his imagination. By the 4th time he stopped looking. The official investigation had all but ground to a halt. The bones were buried. The case files had been moved to storage. The state crime lab, already backed up with fresh homicides, had no interest in an old, unsolvable mystery involving a dead suspect. The town paper stopped running follow-up pieces. People moved on, except the people who lived near the Dyer property. One morning, just after New Year's, a local man named Henry Boyd came into the sheriff's office. Henry was in his late 60s, a quiet man with calloused hands from decades of farm work. He told the desk sergeant he needed to speak with someone about the children. When Mark heard that, he stepped in immediately. Henry's voice was steady, but his eyes kept darting to the door as if to make sure no one else was listening. He said that the week before, in the middle of the night, he had been woken by the sound of something rattling his back door. He thought it was the wind until he heard it again, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. When he looked through the kitchen window, he saw a small boy standing in the snow, barefoot, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned nightshirt. The boy's head was tilted slightly, and his eyes were wrong. Henry couldn't explain how, they just weren't right. Too dark, too still. Henry said he froze. The boy didn't move, didn't speak. Then, after what felt like a full minute, the boy turned and walked toward the fog at the edge of the field. He didn't leave any footprints in the snow. Mark wrote everything down, trying to keep his voice calm. Henry admitted he had never believed in ghosts or anything of the sort, but what he saw that night was no living child. And the worst part, Henry said, is that I think he wanted me to follow him. That story should have been enough to keep Mark away from the Dyer property, but it had the opposite effect. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was trying to be found, or maybe trying to lure someone in. 2 nights later he went back, this time not alone. His friend from the department, Deputy Steve Weller, agreed to come along, though mostly to humor him. They parked at the edge of the overgrown driveway and hiked in with flashlights and a thermos of coffee. The frost crunched under their boots as they approached the well. The steel cover gleamed faintly under the moonlight. Steve tapped it with the toe of his boot and said, "If your ghost kids are in there, they're not coming out tonight." Mark ignored him, crouching down to press his ear to the cold metal. At first there was nothing. Then a faint scrape like fingernails dragging slowly against steel. Steve leaned down beside him, heard it too, and his smirk vanished. They both straightened. The air had gone colder, enough for their breath to billow thickly in the beams of their flashlight. Somewhere beyond the ruined house, something moved, a small shape darting between the weeds, then another. The movements were quick, too quick, like flickers of shadow. Steve swore under his breath. "Coyotes?" he asked, but Mark shook his head. The shapes were upright. The scraping under the steel stopped, replaced by a single knock, then another, then 3 in a row. They backed away, both trying to keep their composure. The fog began to roll in from the fields, swallowing the edges of the property, and then they saw them clearer now. Small figures, maybe 3 or 4 feet tall, just at the edge of the fog. They stood side by side, motionless, their faces pale blurs in the flashlight beams.
Steve whispered, "Holy hell." But before either man could move, the figures stepped backward into the fog and were gone. They left fast after that. Neither one spoke much on the drive back. And when they did, they both agreed not to mention it to the sheriff. There was nothing to prove, nothing to report that wouldn't make them sound insane. Over the next few weeks, strange sightings multiplied. A truck driver claimed he saw a little girl, standing in the middle of the road at dawn, wearing a faded blue dress. When he stopped, she walked into the fog and vanished. A teenager who dared his friends to visit the property came back pale and shaking, saying he'd heard singing from the well. Then came the fire. It happened in late January, just after midnight. A neighbor half a mile from the Dyer property saw an orange glow in the fog and called it in. By the time the fire department arrived, the ruins of the barn were ablaze. Though the old wood was so dry it burned quickly. Mark stood there watching the flames devour what was left of the structure, wondering how a place that had been empty for decades could just ignite. One firefighter swore he saw movement inside the flames, small shadows darting and weaving, untouched by the heat. Another man claimed he heard laughter over the crackle of burning timber. The official cause was never determined. Some blamed squatters. Others said it was arson, but a few whispered that maybe it was something trying to erase what little evidence remained. After the fire, the sightings grew less frequent. The fog still lingered. The steel well cover still hummed faintly if you listened closely, but the shapes in the mist were fewer, more distant. It was almost as if they had retreated, watching from further away. Mark kept thinking about the boy Henry Boyd had seen, about the pale figures that had stood at the edge of the fog. He didn't know if they wanted help or if they wanted something else entirely. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world was still, he sometimes heard 3 slow knocks, just enough to let him know they hadn't gone away. By February, the Dyer property had become a wound the county tried to ignore. The barn was gone, the farmhouse reduced to half-collapsed walls and rotting beams, and the well sat like a dark eye in the frost-covered ground. The official stance was simple, sealed and abandoned, but unofficially, people were still drawn there. Thrill-seekers, drunks, teenagers testing their courage, and the few who couldn't let it go. Deputy Mark Calder fell into that last category. He told himself he was only keeping an eye on the place to deter trespassers, but that wasn't the truth. Something about it had hooked into him. The case was dead on paper, but in his gut it felt alive, unfinished. The trouble was, he wasn't the only one who thought so. One gray afternoon, as Mark sat in his office combing through old county records, the front desk buzzed him. A woman was here to see him, said it was about the children in the well. Her name was Margaret Holt. She was in her mid-70s, tall and wiry, with a long gray braid, and sharp blue eyes that didn't flinch. She wasted no time. "I used to work at the Mercy Home for Orphaned Children in Sacramento," she said, "back in the early 50s, and I remember him. Dyer. He came once, said he was interested in adopting, but he didn't want to go through the process, said the state made things too difficult, offered to make a donation if we'd arrange something privately." Mark leaned forward. "Did you?" Margaret's mouth tightened. "No, but I heard later that he found another way." A few months after he came, 2 children disappeared from a smaller home outside Placerville. Never found. It wasn't in the papers for long. Those places didn't want bad publicity, but I knew it was him. When Mark asked why she'd never come forward, she looked away, because no one wanted to hear it then, and I suppose I thought, what good would it do? But when I read about those bones, I knew it was time. Her story fit too well with the gaps in Dyer's known life. If she was telling the truth, it meant the children in the well could have come from all over the state, maybe even farther. That night Mark drove to the property again, telling himself it was just habit. The frost had melted into a damp chill, and the fog was back, curling through the weeds. The steel cover gleamed faintly in his flashlight beam. He stood over it, listening, and for a long time, there was only the soft hiss of the wind. Then came the tapping, slow, deliberate. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. Mark crouched, his ear inches from the cold metal. Faintly, so faintly he almost doubted it, came a voice, high, thin, childlike. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading. Urgent, he whispered without thinking. What do you want? The tapping stopped, and then from the fog behind him came the crunch of footsteps, small ones. He spun, flashlight sweeping, but saw nothing, only the fog shifting like slow water. The next morning, he tried to tell himself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal moving nearby, but the unease stayed. A week later, another report came in. A young couple passing the property at night claimed they saw a girl in a faded blue dress, standing at the edge of the road. She was barefoot, her skin pale as milk. When they slowed the car, she raised her hand as if to wave them down, but as they stopped, she turned and walked straight into the fog, disappearing in less than 3 steps. Mark drove out to the spot the next day. The ground was soft from recent rain, but there were no footprints. The sightings kept coming. A man delivering feed to a farm nearby swore he saw children running in the field at dawn, their laughter carrying faintly in the still air. An elderly woman claimed she woke to find 2 small figures standing at the foot of her bed, watching her silently, before fading into the dark. The sheriff started getting annoyed. We can't chase every ghost story in the county, Hardwick told Mark. We've got real crimes to deal with. If kids are sneaking out there, fine, catch them, but I'm not signing off on you wasting hours on this. Mark didn't argue. He just kept going back in his own time. One night in March, the fog was thicker than ever. He parked at the edge of the property and walked in slowly, his flashlight beam swallowed almost instantly by the haze. He could barely see the well until he was nearly on top of it. The tapping started almost immediately. 3 knocks, silence, 3 more. Then a sound that froze him in place. A metallic groan, like stressed steel shifting. The welded cover was moving, just slightly, but enough for him to see the faintest quiver in the bolts. Mark's heart pounded. He stepped back, fumbling for his radio, when the fog behind him shifted again. Small shapes, 3 of them this time, just visible in the corner of his vision. He turned the light toward them, but the beam seemed to die in the mist. He called out, "Who's there?" The shapes moved fast, not toward him, but around him, circling. He could hear the crunch of small feet in the damp grass. The air grew colder, so cold his breath came out in thick clouds. Then the tapping on the steel changed faster, now almost frantic. Mark backed away until he was nearly at the remains of the house. The shapes stopped moving. For a long moment, there was only silence. And then, in the fog ahead of him, a small figure stepped forward. A girl, barefoot, blue dress. Her hair hung in wet, stringy strands. Her face was pale, her eyes too dark. She raised one hand slowly, pointing at the well. Mark didn't move. She lowered her hand, tilted her head, and then smiled. It was small and strange, and it made his stomach twist. In the next instant, she stepped back into the fog and was gone. When he turned back toward the well, the tapping had stopped. He left without looking back, but as he drove away, headlights cutting through the endless white, he realized something that made his hands clench the wheel tighter. When the girl had smiled at him, her mouth had been too wide, far too wide.
By April, the fog had thinned with the warming air, but the dire property still carried its own kind of shadow. The weeds had grown taller, curling over the collapsed timbers of the farmhouse. The well remained sealed, the steel cover streaked with rust from the late winter rains. From the road, it looked harmless now, just another forgotten patch of land in rural Yuba County. But people still whispered. Mark Calder didn't talk about what he'd seen in March, not to the sheriff, not to Steve, not to anyone. The girl's too wide smile haunted him in a way that was hard to explain. It was like a photograph burned into the back of his mind, one he couldn't put away. At night, when he closed his eyes, he sometimes saw her standing in the fog, pointing at the well. The calls had slowed, but they hadn't stopped. A farmhand reported hearing children's laughter coming from the tree line one morning, even though he was the only one in the field. A mail carrier swore she saw a boy peering at her from the second-story window of the dire farmhouse ruins. The next day, the sheriff sent someone to check, and the staircase leading to that window was nothing but a heap of splintered boards. Mark started keeping a folder on his desk, separate from official case files, where he recorded every sighting, every strange noise, every unexplained light or shadow. He knew it wasn't police work, not in the official sense, but he couldn't stop. Something about all of it felt like pieces of a puzzle, even if he didn't know the picture yet. Then, in mid-April, something new happened. A man named Daniel Rusk came into the sheriff's office, looking pale and tired, like he hadn't slept in days. He was a long-haul trucker, just passing through, but 2 nights earlier, he had pulled over on the side of the county road, near the Dyer property to rest. Around 2 in the morning, he woke to the sound of knocking, not on his cab door, but from somewhere outside. He climbed down to check, thinking maybe it was an animal, but as soon as his feet hit the gravel, he saw them 3 small children standing at the edge of the road, 2 boys and a girl, all barefoot, their clothes thin and old-fashioned. He said they didn't speak, didn't move, just stared at him with wide, unblinking eyes. When he asked if they were lost, they turned in unison and walked toward the Dyer property. They didn't run, but by the time he tried to follow, they were gone, just gone. No sound, no movement in the weeds. Mark listened to the story without interrupting. When Daniel finished, he asked if the children had looked wrong somehow. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. It was their faces, he said, like they were wearing masks. Smooth, like porcelain. I couldn't see them blink. That same night, Mark decided to stake out the property again. He didn't bring Steve this time. He didn't want witnesses to whatever might or might not happen. He parked far enough away to avoid the crunch of gravel, giving him away, then moved in on foot. The moon was bright, and without the fog, the land looked almost ordinary. The steel cover gleamed in the pale light. Mark crouched in the weeds, just far enough to watch, without being seen. For nearly 2 hours nothing happened. Crickets chirped in the dark. A faint breeze stirred the dry grass. He started to think he'd wasted the night. Then around 1 in the morning, he heard it. The tapping. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more. He moved closer, crouching at the edge of the cover. The steel was cold as always, but this time the sound was different. Louder, closer, and then came something else. A faint voice, a child's whisper too muffled to make out the words. It was followed by another voice, higher pitched, speaking faster, more urgently. Mark felt his pulse quicken. He leaned in, trying to catch the words, but the whispers overlapped, becoming a jumble of sounds. Then, without warning, the steel beneath his hand gave a sharp metallic pop. One of the welded seams had cracked slightly. From the darkness inside the well, came a sudden loud bang, like something slamming against the underside of the cover. The shock of it made him stumble backward. When he looked up, the girl in the blue dress was there. She stood just beyond the circle of moonlight, her hair hanging damp over her face, her head tilted. He could see her pale hands at her sides, fingers twitching slightly. He forced himself to speak. "What do you want?" She didn't answer. Slowly, she raised one hand and pointed not at the well this time, but at him. He felt the air grow colder, the kind of cold that seemed to press through his skin and into his bones. Behind her, shapes began to form in the dark. Small shapes, children. One by one, they stepped into the pale light. 5, 6, maybe more. Their faces were shadowed, but he could feel their eyes on him. The girl dropped her hand. The children began to move toward him, not running, not lunging, just walking steadily. Mark backed away, his boot catching on a loose board in the grass. The children kept coming, their movements unnervingly smooth,
in perfect unison. Then from the well came a sound that froze him in place. A deep, wet gasp, like something taking its first breath in years. The children stopped. Every head turned toward the well. The girl in the blue dress looked back at him once, then turned and walked toward it. The others followed, vanishing into the darkness beyond the edge of the circle of light. Mark didn't stay to see more. He left the property fast, heart pounding, headlights cutting a narrow path through the empty road. For the next 2 nights, he didn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that slow procession of children, the girl pointing at him, and the cracked seam in the steel cover. 3 days later, he went back during daylight, hoping to convince himself it had been a trick of the dark, but the crack in the weld was real, just wide enough for a thin draft of cold air to seep through, and when he pressed his ear to it, he thought just for a second that he heard breathing. That was the moment Mark realized the well wasn't just a grave. Something was still down there. Mark Calder had always considered himself a rational man. Years on the force had taught him to filter out fear and superstition, to look for cause and effect, evidence and motive. But after that night, logic felt like a weak shield against whatever lived in the dire well. He tried to file it away as fatigue, imagination, the tricks of moonlight, and a restless mind. Yet the image of the cracked seam haunted him. By late April, he found himself circling the property in his truck almost every evening. He never parked too close, just enough to catch a glimpse of the steel cover glinting through the tall grass. Sometimes he thought he saw movement, a figure slipping between the trees, a flash of blue fabric. But when he stopped and stared, there was nothing. The rest of the county seemed determined to forget. Spring was warming the air. Wildflowers were pushing through the dirt, and the chatter in town shifted back to crops, repairs and summer plans. But Mark noticed subtle changes. People avoided driving past the dire land after dark. Parents started telling their children not to wander near the creek. The post office stopped delivering to the old route that cut too close to the property. It was early one morning, just past sunrise, when the first sign came that something was worse. A farmer named Wallace Green called the sheriff's office in a panic, claiming he'd found his sheep dead in the pasture. Mark went out, expecting coyotes or stray dogs. Instead, he found the animals arranged in a perfect circle, their bodies untouched except for the eye. Every socket was empty, as though something had scooped them clean. There was no blood, no tracks. When Mark asked Wallace if he'd seen anything, the old man looked pale and shaken. "I heard knocking," he whispered, like someone rapping on the barn wall over and over. Then it stopped. When I went out, they were already like that. 2 nights later, the knocking came to town. At 2:17 a.m., a young mother named Carla Burns called dispatch, her voice trembling. She said someone was knocking at her back door, soft and steady. When she peeked through the blinds, she saw a boy, maybe 8 years old, standing on her porch. His hair was wet, his skin pale, and he wore clothes that looked like they'd been sewn 100 years ago. He didn't say a word, just kept knocking. By the time deputies arrived, the porch was empty, but the wood was wet where he had stood, and a single muddy footprint led down the steps. Mark began to see a pattern, each incident pushing farther from the dire property, as though whatever was in that well was spread. The children weren't bound to the land anymore. They were roaming. The next week, Mark drove to Sacramento to visit the state archives. He'd been digging into old property records and stumbled on something chilling. Before the Dyer family, before the farmhouse was even built, there had been another settlement on that land, a tiny community in the late 1800s. No church, no school, just a few homes and a deep communal well. The record stopped abruptly in 1887, when the settlement was abandoned due to sickness. No details, no survivors listed, just an official note. All remaining structures were burned. The well was sealed. It wasn't until he found a yellowed newspaper clipping in a bound volume that the story took shape. The article described fevered children wandering at night, knocking on neighbors' doors and begging for water. The illness was said to start with thirst, followed by pale skin, glassy eyes and a strange compulsion to seek out others. Those who drank from the well fell ill within days. By the end of the month, the settlement was gone. The few who buried the dead claimed the children didn't look dead at all. They looked as though they were waiting. The hairs on Mark's arms stood on end. When he returned to Yuba County, he didn't go home. He drove straight to the Dyer property. It was just after sunset, and the horizon was a smear of red and gold fading into black. He parked at the edge of the field and walked toward the well. The crack in the seam was wider now, no longer a hairline, but almost an cold air poured from it, smelling faintly of damp earth, and something sweeter, almost metallic. He crouched, listening. The breathing was louder now, and behind it faint irregular tapping. Then came the voice, not just one or two, but dozens. Children whispering, their words tumbling over one another. Some were pleading, some were giggling, some were calling names he didn't recognize. His pulse hammered as he leaned closer, trying to make sense of. That's when the steel shuddered beneath his hand. Slowly, like the turning of a great wheel, the cover began to shift. Mark stumbled back, drawing his sidearm. The seam split wider, the sound of grinding metal cutting through the night. A small hand slid. It was pale and thin, the skin too smooth, the nails blackened. It gripped the edge of the well cover with impossible strength. Another hand followed, then a face, small, round, with wide unblinking eyes and a mouth that curved into that same too perfect smile he'd seen before. The girl, in the blue dress, she crawled out with a strange jerking grace, followed by two boys and another girl. They stood around the well staring at him. Behind them, the darkness inside the well seemed to move, shifting like water. Mark raised his weapon. "Stay where you are." The girl tilted her head, unafraid. "You shouldn't have listened," she said, her voice soft but carrying in the stillness. The ground trembled under his feet. From the well came a deep guttural groan, as if something much larger was waking. The children stepped aside. Something was coming up.
The steel cover toppled fully to the side with a scream of metal, vanishing into the weeds. A rush of air poured from the well, icy and foul, carrying the smell of rot and wet soil that had been buried for centuries. The sound was worse, deep heaving breaths, like some ancient beast drawing its first gulps of air after a long sleep. Mark's instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet locked to the earth. His gun felt useless in his hand. The children had fanned out in a loose half circle, their blank eyes locked on him. The girl in the blue dress didn't blink. From the well's mouth, fingers appeared, long, skeletal, skin stretched taut over knobby joints. Then came the arms, impossibly thin, yet somehow strong enough to pull upward. The figure that emerged didn't climb so much as rise, as though the darkness itself was lifting it. Its head followed, a swollen, misshapen skull, the skin slick and mottled like it had been soaking in water for years. The eyes were pits, deep and glistening. It wasn't human. It might never have been. The children dropped to their knees, faces turned toward the thing in a twisted form of worship. Their lips moved in unison, whispering words Mark couldn't place. An old dialect, maybe older than English itself. The creature's head tilted toward him. That was when the whispers stopped. "You came back," it said. The voice wasn't one sound, but many, male and female, young and old, all speaking at once. The words scraped against his ears like rusted metal. Mark forced himself to speak. "What are you?" It smiled, or at least, the folds of its face shifted into something that might have been a smile. "We are what is left." It slid fully out of the well. Its body was draped in tattered cloth that might once have been robes, but they were stiff with blackened muck. Water dripped from every edge of it, pattering into the grass. The girl in the blue dress stood. "He's thirsty," she said almost sweetly. Before Mark could react, two of the boys were at his sides. Their hands were like iron on his arms, impossibly strong for their small frames. He tried to twist away, but their grip tightened until pain flared through his shoulders. The thing moved closer, each step slow and deliberate. The grass withered where it passed, curling black under its weight. It stopped inches from his face. "We remember the thirst," it said. "We remember the ones who sealed us in. You unsealed us." Mark's mind flashed through the newspaper clipping, the fevered children, the abandoned settlement. This thing, whatever it was, had been in that well for over a century, feeding off anyone who came too close, and now it was free. The creature raised one of its long hands and pressed its cold, damp palm to his cheek. The chill burned like frostbite. His vision swam. In that instant, his mind wasn't his own anymore. Images poured into him, a settlement of smiling children by a clear well. Then the same children days later, their skin pale, their lips cracked, eyes glassy with hunger and thirst. The parents tried to leave, but the children begged them to stay. At night they came knocking on doors, not for food, not for warmth, but for water. He saw the day they sealed the well, the screaming as the last of the children were pushed inside. He felt the crushing darkness, the endless cold, the hunger that never ended. The connection snapped, and Mark collapsed to his knees, gasping. "You will bring more," the creature said. "You will tell them. They will come." It turned away, retreating toward the open mouth of the well. One by one the children followed, slipping into the darkness, like fish into deep water. The girl in the blue dress was the last. She paused, meeting his eyes. "We'll knock," she said, "and when you open the door, you'll never close it again." Then she was gone. Mark staggered to his feet, staring at the yawning hole in the earth. The smell of rot and damp was already fading. The well cover lay where it had fallen, but he couldn't bring himself to move it back into place. His hands were shaking too hard. He left the property without looking back. Over the next week, he tried to go about life as if nothing had happened, but the knocking began in town again. First on the outskirts, then deeper into the neighborhoods. Always at night, always a soft, steady rhythm, like water dripping in a sink. Those who opened their doors vanished. The sheriff's office stopped answering calls from certain addresses. They'd arrived to find the homes empty. Dinner still on the table, doors wide open. Mark didn't sleep. He kept his gun loaded, and the lights on. But the knocking came for him too. 3 nights after the disappearances began, it started 3 gentle raps on his front door. Then silence, then 3 more. He stood in the dark, holding his breath, watching the door handle from the hallway. A child's voice called his name, soft, almost playful. The next morning, he packed what he could and left Yuba County. He drove until the land turned to desert, until there were no wells for miles. Still, some nights, even in the driest places, he swears he hears it. Knock, knock, and he knows one day, no matter where he runs, he'll open the door, and so the well sleeps once more. But only until the next curious soul disturbs its silence. Some say the children are still down there, waiting, whispering, "Watch." Others believe they walk among us now, knocking on doors when the moon is high. If you hear it, 3 soft knocks in the dead of night, don't open the door, because once you do, you'll never close it again. This is the Crimson Truth, where the darkest stories are never just stories.